Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the third section of the first chapter of Peter Berger's Heretical Imperative, which I've entitled Promethean Man and the Heretical Imperative. So this is from Berger's book from 1979, subtitled Contemporary Possibilities of Religious Affirmation. For Berger, modern man is a Promethean figure, and ever since the Enlightenment has seen himself as such. But he's also nervous. The experience of the transition from fate to choice, which remember is key to this chapter, is very ambivalent. It's on the one hand a great liberation, but it's also alienating and a source of anxiety and even terror. A concept which you find in a number of great modern thinkers, including Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky. But it's also a common experience. A modern city in the global south is full of such people who are both attracted by modernity with its promises of new freedom and possibilities of life and self-realization as by a magnet, but have to pay a high price for that liberation. Though its material promises may not always be realized, it is still a liberation from the narrow confines of tradition, poverty, and the bonds of clan and tribe. Modernity brings us the experience of being alone in a way which is unthinkable in a traditional society. We become deprived of the firm solidarity of the collectivity, uncertain of what norms by which our lives are governed, uncertain of who or what we are. An African villager cast adrift in the tumultuous world of Lagos or Nairobi will not have heard much of European philosophy, but he will experience the living reality of what Sartre termed being condemned to freedom. Whilst philosophers argue whether this is an adequate description of the human condition, the sociologist knows that it perfectly summarizes the condition of modernity, and would add that it is only under modern conditions that it would have widespread plausibility. We mustn't exaggerate the alienated desperation of modern individuals, however. Most people do not live in a prolonged state of angst. It's Camus rather than Sartre who was right on this point. Most people manage somehow, perhaps continuing to live in and by the remnants of traditional structures, or constructing new arrangements to afford a measure of certainty, or just keeping themselves busy. Modern men are not all do-it-yourself existentialists tottering on the brink of an abyss of despair. Rather, it has simply become much more difficult to arrange oneself in the universe in modern society compared to the traditional ones. It has become impossibly difficult for some, but we should not generalize from that. Nor is the modern situation completely unprecedented, though it is new. There were other parallel periods in which what was taken for granted was shaken, for example in the Hellenistic period, but the scale of the modern pluralization of meanings and values and the number of people impacted is probably unprecedented. The reason for this is modern technology. Like everything else, the sense of relativity can be mass communicated. Liberation and alienation are the reverse sides of the same coin of modernity. They're inextricably linked. To want liberation without alienation is the recurring fantasy of modern revolutionaries. To see alienation without liberation is the Achilles heel of almost all conservatives. From the beginning, the alienating impact of modernity has led to a nostalgia for a restored world of order, meaning, and solidarity. Both modernization and counter-modernization are cognate processes. The yearning for deliverance from the alienation of modernity, may take different forms. Most straightforwardly is reactionary yearnings, ideologies that look to the past for meaning, while seeing the present as a state of degeneration, quixotic socio-political praxis in attempts to restore pre-modern structures. Alternatively, progressive yearnings the present being seen as dehumanizing and intolerable, but the restored world being projected into the future in the form of modern revolutionary ideologies and movements, Marxism being prototypical with its counter-modern nostalgia. In theory, nothing in history is irreversible, but it's hard to see how modernization could be reversed. The foundation for sustaining such large numbers of people on the earth as it is at present is modern technology, and this situation has built-in plurality and instability. The modern totalitarian state is a major exception, however. Its central goal is the restoration of a pre-modern order of stable meanings and firm collective solidarity, but paradoxically employs the most modern means of communication and control, themselves alienating in their effect. It's a recent phenomena, and it has been a human tragedy of unprecedented scope, so it's not a source of hope for the future. But if we reject it, we will have to find some other way of coping with the world of choice. Obviously, religion is not the only aspect of life and thought impacted by the transition from fate to choice. Morality and those political institutions claiming any kind of moral authority are also impacted. The modern situation of religion will not be adequately explained unless its relation to this fate to choice transition is examined. The impact of modernity on religion has often been seen in terms of secularization, with religion losing its hold on both social institutions and human consciousness. And of course, there's a vast literature on secularization, which is not reviewed here. Instead, Berger wants to focus on something else, and that is that there's a clear link between secularization and the pluralization of plausibility structures. Like any other interpretation of reality, a religious worldview depends on social support. The more unified and reliable that support is, the more that interpretation of reality will be firmly established in consciousness. Typically, a pre-modern society creates conditions under which religion has objective certainty for the individual. But modern society undermines that certainty, de-objectivizing it by taking away its taken-for-granted status. It subjectivized religion as per the fate-to-choice transition. The pre-modern individual is linked to his gods by the same inexorable destiny as the rest of his existence, but modern man must choose between gods, a plurality of which is socially available to him. Pre-modern man typically experiences religious certainty, but modern man experiences religious doubt. This is not an absolute difference. Some pre-modern individuals struggled with doubt, and many today experience, or some at least experience, unshakable conviction. But there's a difference in the frequency distribution. Uncertainty is dramatically greater in the modern situation. It's typical. This has a secularizing impact, though there may well be other causes of secularization, of course. The English word heresy comes from the Greek hairein, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to choose. Originally, a heresis was the taking of a choice. A derived meaning was that of an opinion. In the Pauline epistles of the New Testament, the word already had a specifically religious connotation, a faction or party within the wider religious community which had rallied around a particular religious opinion which its members had chosen. Later church institutions gave it a more specific theological legal meaning. This etymology is very illuminating. For the concept of heresy to have meaning, the authority of a religious tradition is presupposed. One could only take a heretical attitude in relationship to such an authority. The heretic was one who denied the authority, completely refusing to accept the tradition in total. Rather, he picked and chose those bits of the tradition he liked to form his own deviant opinion. Presumably, there have always been rebels and innovators in human communities, and authority figures have always been troubled by them. reaction to some of the pre-Socratics, for example. But the context has changed with the coming of modernity. In pre-modern situations, there is a world of religious certainty, only occasionally disrupted by heretical deviations. But under modernity, there is a world of religious uncertainty in which religious affirmations are occasionally precariously constructed to stave off uncertainty. Under pre-modernity, heresy is a remote possibility. But under modernity, it becomes a necessity. Picking and choosing becomes imperative. Now, suddenly, heresy no longer stands out against a clear background of authoritative tradition. The background has become dim or has even disappeared. Whilst the background was still there, most individuals could simply accept the taken for granted consensus that surrounded them and not pick and choose. But now the that social consensus is no longer available, so we must pick and choose, unless we belong to some small quasi-sectarian community which provides social consensus. When we have begun to pick and choose, we become conscious of having done so. We know that a community of consent has been deliberately constructed and have a sense of the constructedness of community affirmations. Inevitably, those affirmations will be fragile, and that fragility will be close to our own consciousness. Berger then takes the example of Jewish emancipation in the modern West. In the ghetto, or East European shtetl, people did not choose to be Jews. Jewishness was taken for granted as part of one's existence and was reaffirmed by everyone else in the social milieu. The theoretical possibility of conversion to Christianity existed, but the social pressures against that were enormous. There were different ways of being Jewish, but Jewishness itself was an objective and subjective reality. Emancipation changed that situation. More and more individuals could step outside the Jewish community. Being Jewish became a choice amongst them. External anti-Semitism and internal ethnicity braked this development, but it still progressed quite far in Western and Central Europe in the 19th century. Then, in the 20th century, pluralistic America saw it further developed. It's very hard in the 20th century US just to take Jewish identity for granted. But those Jews who still affirm even a moderately orthodox Jewish identity continue to define it as a fact, despite all the empirical evidence to the contrary. That is, things like outmarriage. The Orthodox maintain that Jewish identity is destiny, whilst individual experience reveals it to be an ongoing choice. This dissonance between definition and experience lies at the core of every orthodoxy in the modern world, not just the Jewish one, although the Jewish case is particularly clear. The orthodox of any tradition define it as taken for granted, but for the individual, that is continually falsified by the experience of living in modern society. It's difficult for the individual to present their identity as fate when they experience it as choice. Thus, such movements as the Lubavitcher Hasidim create an artificial shtetl for their followers. Unlike the old shtetl, the individual can leave the new one by taking the subway and joining the emporium of lifestyles, identities, and religious preferences of mainstream American pluralism. No matter how fervent the convert's acceptance of neo-traditionalism, it's hard to believe that individuals raised in the United States can ignore this empirical fact. Thus, the peculiarly American phrase of religious preference is very weighty. It contains the whole fate to choice crisis of pluralism in which cognitive dissonance is inbuilt, and the heretical imperative is a root phenomenon of modernity. Heresy once attracted marginal and eccentric types. Now it has become universalized as a general condition. The rest of this book examines the implications of this. Confronting the heretical imperative has not been easy for either the simple believer or the most sophisticated theologian. There's been a spectrum of reactions from total rejection to total embrace of the new situation. Both of these have difficulties. To oversimplify slightly, the history of modern Western theology has been the drama of this confrontation within the heretical imperative. Within Judaism, Western Judaism, has experienced the same pattern in different form as a minority group within Western culture. As modernization becomes global, so too has the heretical imperative, as in Buddhist and Muslim centers of learning and the homespun advice given to illiterate villagers by religious functionaries. Thus, all world religions now have a commonality of condition that must impact their self-understanding and should impact their relations with each other. So many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their support. You're very welcome to support my channel. Do, if you want, like, comment, share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give details of my Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide support that way. Next week we'll talk about realities and experience, the first part of Berger's second chapter. Have a good day.